So hold me close, nothing lasts forever. Oh, when I go, will you remember? Will you...
All right, welcome back to the channel, everybody. It's been a while since I've been on. I've just moved. I've got a house that I just bought and had to reset up the studio and fix a lot of things in the house as well. So it's been a while for me, but I hope the wait's been worth it because we got Dr. Joshua Bowen with us today, and he has agreed to come on and talk with me about the book of Daniel and some of the prophecies, and also how do we know that the dating of it's accurate and things like that. So Dr. Josh, is that okay if I call you Dr. Josh?
Please.
Okay. Please tell us, our viewers, a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. Well, I thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. So I was a fundamentalist evangelical Christian for 20, 25, 26 years, something like that. Yeah, grew up in the church, very, conservative family. And I pastored a church out in Virginia for 7 years as an associate pastor. I went to Liberty University, got my bachelor's degree, and I went to Capital Bible Seminary, got a master's in theology, both very conservative schools. And then I was a chaplain in the Air Force. Sorry, trying to keep the timeline straight in my head.
It's okay.
But in 2009, I went to Johns Hopkins University to get my PhD in the field of Assyriology, which is just the languages and cultures of ancient Iraq. And I minored in Hebrew Bible as well, because that was my background from seminary. And so while I was there, that first year that I was at Johns Hopkins, I deconverted, became an atheist, and spent the rest of my 7 or 8 years at Hopkins not really concerned too terribly much about religion or faith, just working on my PhD. When I got out, when I graduated in 2017 with my PhD, I had to take a job outside of academia. But in 2018, I found myself on social media doing stuff like this, trying to help mostly people in the atheist community kind of understand their Bibles better, understand the ancient Near East better, and to, hate to say it, but work against Christian apologetics and some of, I think, their very poor understandings or misrepresentations of the biblical text, which, it's just very common and understandable. And it's not that I hold it against them or anything, as I think I said the same things, right? To greater or lesser degrees when I was a Christian. So I understand it, but they're problematic. So I feel like that's part of what I do. But my wife and I primarily, she runs a channel called Digital Hammurabi. And we talk about the ancient Near East, talk about the Hebrew Bible, and try to just make it fun and understandable to interested non-specialists who like to know about the ancient world. So
Yeah, and that's the whole reason I brought you on, because I was reading your book. Well, I can't say I was actually reading. I listened to the audiobook version because
it's the best way to do it.
Oh my gosh, yes, because I haven't actually got to meet Seth Andrews, but like in my head, he's like the atheist voice of God.
Yes, no doubt.
And so, and if he hears this, that's what I'm calling him from now on. Because his voice is just so wonderful to listen to.
Yeah. It was great working with him.
And he made it really interesting to listen to, and for when you just get into it and listen to it with him reading it, you almost think it's his book for a minute, even though
Right.
it's not. But it's just the way he reads it. It's just
Yeah.
so good.
Yeah.
And so really glad that you got him to read that. And, I had to listen to it a couple times because, there's just so much to take in. I'll probably listen to it again. But so the reason, again, was we were going to talk about, especially your chapter 5. And
Mm.
you did two parts on that in the about the book of Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly read over the basis for the discussion for how the Jehovah's Witnesses perceive the book of Daniel, some of their dating, and how they apply it to their theology.
Okay.
And then, we'll go on to discuss some other points about that. So I'm going to just read word for word what I wrote because it'll be better. Okay, so I'll pick right back up. So basically, the Jehovah's Witnesses believe that Judah was destroyed in 607 BCE. They say that Daniel chapter 4, verse 17 has two fulfillments, the first having to do with King Nebuchadnezzar, and the second having to do with when they say Judah was destroyed in 607 to mark the beginning of the 7 times where God's rulership would be interrupted. For example, no more kings in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Then they take Revelation chapter 12, verse 6 about the 3.5 times being 1,260 days,
Mm-hmm.
and double that for the 7 times, and you get 2,520 days. And then they take Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 6 about a day for a year and calculate 2,520 years from the year 607 to
Why
get
not?
to 1914. I know, pretty convoluted, isn't it? This is literally what they do. And this is in 1914 for the witnesses. They say this is when the beginning of the last days happened. It's when Jesus was established as king and therefore gives them their authority and all that. So that little side point there. And so another side note on that too is before 1914 actually happened or was around when they were predicting it, they actually said that was going to be the year of Armageddon and the end of the last days.
Sure.
After it passed, of course, you know how most religions are when they have a failed prophecy, they have to change it.
Like,
so then it became
we missed something.
the beginning of the last days instead
Right.
of the end. So, and so the biggest thing for this, why I'm saying this, is because this teaching is the foundation for which they make a lot of their other claims.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a pretty brief explanation of it. You know who Lloyd Evans is, right?
Yes.
He's actually made a couple videos, and he updated his 607 1914 video and did one again just recently talking about this. And I'll put a thumbnail about the video up here to show the viewers. But that was just a brief overview of their theology and how they get to that. And I know just reading that to you in your face, you're just like, that is just so convoluted. So,
yeah.
And one thing I want to also mention, and you mentioned this in your book as well, and we mentioned this in our discussion before the video. You have said to me in your book that you are by no means an expert on the book of Daniel, but the references you have, you pull from a lot of other experts as well to put together this. And even though I know you're not the foremost expert on it or anything, you are still way more qualified than the religion I came from to be talking about this, because you actually cite your sources and references and let everybody know where you're getting it from, whereas they don't. So I just want
let me, I guess maybe I'll, for the audience, I'll just kind of clarify what I think qualifies me to talk about this. So you know, I have a master's in theology in Old Testament studies in Hebrew Bible. So I spent 6 years reading Hebrew and Aramaic and Ugaritic. I taught Hebrew for 2 years at the graduate level, and that was all just in my master's degree. And then when I went to Johns Hopkins, I minored in Hebrew Bible, so I took Hebrew every semester, um, and I had a comprehensive exam in Hebrew. So, like I know Hebrew very very well, and took Aramaic as well, both biblical Aramaic and Targumic Aramaic. So that there are people that major in Hebrew Bible, and then there are people that minor in Hebrew Bible and major in something else. So I was the latter, right? I majored in Assyriology, so I studied Akkadian and Sumerian languages and literature. Um, Part of that was because I had so much experience with Hebrew by that point, that it seemed like the right thing to do to branch out a little bit. But this is why I defer, and I don't call myself an expert. I'm reticent to actually call myself a biblical scholar because I feel like, while I probably am, uh, I feel like a biblical scholar has a PhD where they majored in Hebrew Bible. So yeah, but that's I guess in some ways neither here nor there.
But
Uh,
I was gonna say the whole point of the matter though is you've studied it a lot more from more non-biased and from more of a I know you said you don't want to go into the methodological areas too much because that's a whole lot to cover, but the methods that you use to study it and everything are compiled together in a way to where the consensus can
yeah.
be as accurate as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I would say is that this discussion about the dating of the book of Daniel is one of these places where people have I think, some faulty conclusions that they start with, particularly about scholars that work in the book of Daniel. So, for example, uh, you'll see this a lot online where if somebody says, oh, the book of Daniel is written in the 2nd century, well, those people that you'll hear, those scholars just believe the supernatural is impossible, or the prophecy is impossible. Predictive prophecy is impossible. And so they start with that, those liberal scholars, they begin there. Supernatural is impossible. And so they have to date it, to the 2nd century. Well, I mean, you can probably tell by the way that I said all those things, that's not the case,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Many biblical scholars that hold to a 2nd century date, of the book, at least of its compilation, are Christian scholars, many of them evangelical scholars. So that argument certainly doesn't hold. They certainly don't deny the supernatural. So that's one that, from a methodological standpoint, we have to begin with questions like, first of all, what are the data points? What are the facts on the ground? And once we identify those sorts of things, then we have to say, what is the model, the interpretive model that best accounts for all those data points? And that's what scholars do. That's why they come to these conclusions and there's consensus, because they're all working with the same data points. And just most of them have said, yeah, this is the interpretive model that best accounts for all these data points. So yeah, I mean, I think that's an important thing to say. I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So let me start off there then. Like one of the biggest things that really stuck out in my mind when I was listening to the atheist God read your book to me was how by the use of language you are able to determine when certain things were written. So can you just talk about that a little bit for me?
Yeah, and So to be clear, like these are not intended to be, they can't be exact sciences in the sense that well, let me give some examples. If you were to go dig down in a local landfill, you know, we've got one a couple miles from the house. If you were to just go out there and dig down into it and start pulling up Coke cans, right? Coca-Cola cans, pretty quickly, if you use the internet and, you know, lay them all out, you'll be able to tell that Coke can comes from 1974. That Coke can comes from 1986, and so on. The reason that you can do that is because the styles of the Coke cans, if I'm remembering that correctly, change quickly and consistently,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the same sort of principle, right? So if I were to say to you, hey, you know, I found this document and it was written by Shakespeare, and you say, oh, that's cool, and I say, let me read it to you. What ho, my dude, right? Like let's go to the club. You know, you might say, what's that now? Like Shakespeare said, my dude. Like, I mean,
Right.
let's go to the club. That you know that doesn't seem to fit, right?
Right.
And it's because from a language standpoint, the words, the phrases, they're not in use during that period, right? So that's a very general sort of analogy to it. Now with ancient languages, um, and again, like there are people that spend their entire careers working on this sort of thing. Uh, so you know, a great place to start with this is John Collins up at Yale has a 1993 commentary where he lays all of this out. And of course, many people have written on it since then. Um, so, but just so the audience knows, you know, that's a great scholar to start with. Um, but uh, basically, if you think about the word show, if you have an old King James Bible, and I don't know, do Jehovah's Witnesses use a King James Bible?
No, Jehovah's Witnesses actually have their own version of the Bible that they translate it.
Okay. Does it have
So
that sort of archaic language in it?
no, it doesn't. They
Okay.
actually in their 80, I want to say 84 revision that they did, it was pretty much modern English, and then they revised it again in 2013. But that their revisions and stuff are a whole nother story because they actually changed stuff in
I
it
see.
to fit their theology even more so as time goes on. So, but they use their own
Okay.
translation that they made up basically.
Well, if you pick up an old King James Bible, you'll see the word show is spelled Shew. And I've had people actually online who are King James onlyists, right? And you know,
Mm-hmm.
if you're not saved using the King James Bible, you're not really saved. They've said to me like, "Well, look, I'm going to shew you something. Here, let me shew you this in the verse." And you're like, "The hell is shew?" And it's because they're pronouncing the word Shew like it looks, but it's actually meant to be pronounced show, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, like the EW in the word so.
Right. No,
Uh,
I completely get it. Yeah.
so the difference, of course, is that's just an older spelling. It's an older orthography, which is the fancy way of saying how they spelled it, right? So if you see a text that has words like show spelled Shew, you say that's older English than a text that has it spelled Show. And that sort of principle is what applies. So there are you know, different grammatical forms. Um, I guess a really good example would be like thee, thou, thine in English.
Yeah.
You know, we
Yeah.
don't use those anymore. So if you see them, these are all English examples, but it's the same sort of thing that takes place in any language. So in Hebrew and in Aramaic, the two languages primarily that are used in trying to set the general dating of the different parts of the Book of Daniel, um, there are different stages through historical stages that the Hebrew language went through. So some of our oldest inscriptions, inscriptional um, Hebrew, it has certain grammatical features to it. And then as time goes by, you have like transitional biblical Hebrew, late biblical Hebrew, and the grammatical forms change, the ways that certain verbs are put together, certain usages are no longer used. And so, again, I don't want to go into a whole bunch of detail about the specifics of that, trying to keep it general. Um, you can take a text, and if you have um, enough material to overview and to sort of catalog and identify, all right, here are the different ways. Like, look, for the English, anytime we have the second person you, plural, being used, they say ye, right? Well, you know, if all the times that you see second person plural being used, you know, ye being used for that, you would say, all right, the likelihood is an older text. Of course, the other possibility is that it's a later text and somebody's writing, trying to make it look like an older text, right?
Here's a
Like,
question. Oh, I'm sorry.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
Because as you were saying all that, I was wondering as well, is there any instances in the Hebrew where the usage of words and the meaning changes? And I'll give you an example, like in English, like back in the 1950s, the word gay was
Sure.
always for a happy person. Now we use it in a term for a homosexual person.
Right.
Are there any
Yeah.
instances like that as well?
Sure. I'm trying to think of some off the top of my head. And I can't, unfortunately. But one of the things that you'll see if you pick up like a Hebrew lexicon, if you like a Hebrew dictionary, if you a biblical Hebrew dictionary, if you go to like Blue Letter Bible or something, oftentimes what you'll see is a list of different English words that that are used to translate this one Hebrew word. And the reason for that is there are different reasons for that. One is that words are multivalent, right? They can have different meanings. They're polysemous. But some of it is that as time goes by, words take on different nuances, right?
Mhm.
So, like the word Torah, like Torah, is one that it seems like as time goes by, it starts to entail or indicate more than just the first section of the Old Testament. But yes, there are certain lexemes. The word to understand is in Hebrew is one that as time goes by, it takes on a different meaning. And that's one of what they call the diagnostic features that indicates, okay, we're probably dealing with a later text as opposed to an earlier one.
And that kind of actually gets into what one of my next questions was for you about diagnosis. Can't get my words right. Diagnosis syntax. And
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
So, I mean, if your audience just think about the word diagnosis, as you said, or diagnostic. When you go to a doctor and they say, "All right, what's wrong with you?" and you say, "Why, I have a cough." Well, that's not really diagnostic of anything. There are lots of different things that could, cause a cough. But if you walk in there and you say, I don't know, I have this huge rash on my neck, and they look at the spots and they're raised in a certain way, they can very quickly say that is diagnostic of poison ivy,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there are certain things that are standalone. You can look at it and go, "Oh, that's what that is." I can make the diagnosis right there. Then there are other things like I have multiple sclerosis, and that's one of the things that there isn't like a one single indicator that you have MS. It's sort of a constellation of symptoms.
Yeah.
That after you have several of them, that say, "All right, we did an MRI and we see these lesions on your brain, and we noticed that you had optic neuritis, and your left arm goes numb." These other things. Those sort of things all come together. They become diagnostic together. And so those are the sorts of things that we use in language as well. And so when there are certain things that are just very clear, the word show being spelled S-H-E-W, I'd say that's a diagnostic feature. It's like that only shows up in an older text, thee, thou, thine. Those are diagnostic. Other things, you know, if there are, if I were to say you've got bats in the belfry, right? Or if you were to say, what's another sort of fossilized form? Yeah, I don't know. I can't think of another one, but like that's those are things that are older, but we still use them today. They've become sort of fossilized, but they're only used in very specific contexts, right? So if you say somebody's got bats in the belfry, it's because they're crazy, right? So, but you don't use the word belfry anywhere else. I can't think of any other time that I would use belfry. Um,
I don't even know what
except in,
belfry is.
yeah, it's like I think it's where the bell is, where you in the tower you
Oh,
ring the
okay.
bell. I
Okay.
think. See, even there, you don't even know what the
Right.
parts of it are, right?
Right.
So yeah, those are sort of diagnostic features. So in Aramaic, the use of the letter Z as opposed to the letter D, there are certain words where Z appears when you would expect a D and vice versa. And, you know, which one is used becomes sort of a diagnostic feature that, oh, this is later or this is earlier, those sorts of things. So that's what they talk about. It's when they're reading through the language and they see, oh, the cohortative is being used here, but it doesn't have a cohortative meaning. You know, okay, that's sort of diagnostic, that we're dealing with this particular, you know, period of time. So that's
So from what it sounds like, in a way, like you basically you have, if we're using the analogy of like a doctor's office, you have symptoms of a
yes,
text that you can look at and observe, and then you can, by the whole context of it and whatever else you can find around it, you know, of course, you know, that's one of the things the Christians like to say, you know, take in the context, you know.
yeah,
But by all that though, you can diagnose
yes,
where that text came from, and not, I know not exact dates or whatever,
yeah.
but a general period of time that you can narrow it down to.
Yeah, and I mean to keep with the sort of doctor medical analysis or an analogy, um, you know, my 3-year-old son has had these bumps on his body for the past 2 or 3 days, and it's clear that it was some sort of allergic reaction,
Hmm.
right? Because it's showing up in different parts of his body and then going away, and then it shows up in other parts. So it's not like poison ivy or something where it's sticking around and it's on one spot. So he took him to the doctor, and the doctor said, well, this is an allergic reaction. And they're like, oh, okay, to what?
Yeah.
So we've narrowed it down. The diagnosis has been narrowed down to certain things, right? And there are things that you can check for. Or check his clothing. Is there some new detergent that you've used, or is there, you know, something in his sheets, or is he using a down blanket? So we've narrowed it down,
Right.
but we haven't pinpointed it, and that's you know how you have to sort of think about a lot of these things, where it's like there's a range sometimes of centuries where it's like it could fall into this range because we see other documents that appear in this range. They use the same sort of things, but you see earlier when they're not using them, and then here in these centuries they are, and then later they're not. So it's sort of in this range.
That kind of answered one of my next questions, because
Oh, sorry.
no, you're good. You're good. Because I was going to ask, how long of a period of time does it take in order to detect these changes in languages?
Yeah.
You know, and like you were just saying, it could be a very broad period of time. I know in our age we live in now, things can change very rapidly,
Yes.
just because of the nature of how information is exchanged and passed through social media and the internet and all that. But back then they didn't have that.
Yeah, maybe a good, I'm all about analogies today, I guess. A good analogy of that is there are lots of different dialects of Arabic, and I have no expertise in Arabic, so I'm going to just, you know, forgive me, any Arabic speakers out there that are like, what? That's not right. But I think it is, though. When movies were the main. So sorry, Egyptian Arabic used to be like the main or the most common dialect of Arabic. And I want to say like in the 70s, 80s, 90s, I think. But it's because there were lots of movies and Egyptian, I guess there were a lot of Egyptian actors or whatever, actresses. I think that's what it was, but it had to do with movies. But then I think in the late 90s, maybe, and later, when Iraq became the focus in the news, then Iraqi Arabic started to become the most common dialect that people like the most common dialect that people used. And but again, even if I'm wrong about the details of that same sort of, even if we just assume that's correct for a second, the principle there would be the spread of information, how often that gets put out, how many people are exposed to it. Those types of things can change very rapidly if the technology changes and the circumstances change sufficiently to bring about that type of widespread exposure. And so you do see those sorts of things when you have more rapid contextual changes, population movements, those sorts of things. It can change more drastically.
Okay. Yeah, this is all a very good basis, I think, for this discussion. So I I put out to some of my friends and stuff to see if they had any specific questions they wanted to ask you, and I got one reply, and this is from my good friend Stefan, and he wanted to know, was Daniel a forgery?
Yeah. So talking about the different meanings of words, I always get a little nervous with the word forgery. And the reason that I get nervous is because it seems to carry, I mean, it definitely today carries like moral implications, right? Somebody says forgery, it's like, ooh, bad, right? That's an
Mhm.
immoral thing to do. Um, if we're just using the term to mean somebody writing a document pretending it's by somebody else, then yes, I think it is a forgery, and I think that's pretty common because whoever's compiling the book and putting these, particularly these later visions together, trying to make it, represented as this guy in the 6th century, is it's either happening to this person or he's writing some of these things or saying some of these things. So yes, I mean, in that sense, it's being presented as something that's composed in the 6th century, um, you know, by this guy Daniel, right? And it's not something that's put together in the 2nd century, utilizing earlier materials, particularly earlier Aramaic materials, and then mixing it or combining it together with Hebrew chapters that are written in that time in the 2nd century to create this ancient looking text. And we could talk about why later, but um, yes. So I would say in that sense, taking out the moral component from the word forgery, yes, I think it is.
Okay.
Um, did that make sense?
Yeah, it did, because in a way, what it sounds like is that, and I guess this will just be me re-explaining it back what you just said. It was written at a later time to make it look like it was written at an earlier time,
Yes.
and that's the general gist of what I think you were just saying,
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
very elaborate, eloquent way.
But something that you were able to simplify within 5 seconds. So
I like to keep things simple. So what so like what sources do um most scholars and everybody go by, when from ancient sources and everything, when trying to determine the accuracy and validity of dating different things in the Bible and Daniel and all that?
uh, Yes. Very broad question.
Yeah, I know, I know.
Um, so from a linguistic side, um, again, the two primary languages that you hear about are Aramaic and Hebrew. So there are lots of Aramaic texts, groups of texts that that scholars use in comparing, it to Daniel. So, like, I won't list them all out, but like they have these different groups of Aramaic texts um, that scholars will look at. They'll figure out what are the diagnostic features of those groups of texts, and then and we know when they're dated, right? So you have like texts from Elephantine, you have texts, the Sumerian papyri, you have books of Ezra, Nehemiah. Like we have stuff from Qumran.
And
I
if I
said I
may,
wasn't going to
how
name.
do you know when they were dated?
Yeah. Well, so the Elephantine papyri, uh, like we have archaeological context for that. There's a new book that came out 2020, I think, that goes into great detail about the group of Jews that are in Elephantine down in Egypt. And so archaeological context, historical context, like there are certain things that you can tell. Again, each one is going to be different, for the different groups. But once you have those sort of anchored, then you come to a text like that. The problem with the Hebrew Bible is that we don't have any texts that, even for Daniel, that go back to the time of writing. So all the manuscripts that we have come from later. Now for Daniel, it's not much later. It's maybe 50, 60 years later, but none that actually go back to the time of writing, because they all come from Qumran. Those are our earliest, the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want a Dead Sea Scrolls specialist to come on and talk about that, Dr. Kip Davis is the one to bring on. If you need me to, I could put in a good word.
No, I'd appreciate that. Yeah, that
Uh,
that actually sounds really interesting.
yeah, he's a brilliant Dead Sea Scrolls specialist. But so that's what they do, is like we have these sort of more or less not fixed, but like we know the range of dates for these occur in the fourth, these date to the 4th century, or these date to the middle of the 4th century, these date to the 5th century. And so then you can, once you plot them, once you lay them out, then you take the book of Daniel and you say, all right, let's take the Aramaic sections, the Aramaic chapters, and let's get the diagnostic features. Now, where do they plug in? Right. The problem with Aramaic is that, it's not terribly precise during this time. So it's like, you could date this stuff 5th century, I think, all the way down into, coming up on Qumran, the time of Qumran. So it's like, it doesn't really narrow it down a lot. It seems like it's later on balance, but the Aramaic isn't really the thing that really helps scholars not pinpoint it, but get it closer.
Right.
It's the Hebrew that does that. And so again, the same sort of thing is true with the Hebrew. When you look at, what the different developments of the Hebrew language, and then you look at Qumran, the Hebrew from Qumran, what they have concluded, again, the people that dedicate their careers to this stuff, and again, we could go through the arguments, but it would put everybody to sleep, is that it's not quite as late as Qumran. Qumran has some slightly later features, but it's like really close. Like it's like slightly pre-Qumranic time.
Mm-hmm.
So again, that fits very well, both the Aramaic broadly, and then the Hebrew much more precisely, generally speaking, or relatively speaking. to that period in the 2nd century. But that's just from a linguistic standpoint. The thing that really drives the argument home is what's actually in the text themselves, content-wise. And probably the biggest, and maybe we want to get into this later, but like when you look at the details, what's being described, particularly in the 2nd half of the book, it's very clear that these are events that took place in the late 3rd, early to middle 2nd century BCE.
And what exactly are some of those events that point to that?
Yeah. So there are basically 4 main visions that you have in the 2nd half of the book of Daniel, right? 7, 8, 9, and 10 through 12. And I go into this in the book, how to solidify this. But again, this is just, everybody agrees on this. All 4 visions, sometimes more specifically and precisely, and sometimes more vaguely, but still, I think pretty clearly, are talking about the time of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who, is doing some bad stuff to the Jews, right in the right around the mid 2nd century, 167, 165 BCE. And so what, like, if, for example, if you look in chapters 8 and particularly chapter 12, it mentions Greece, right? Very specifically, like here, this is Greece, right? And Greece is always the final kingdom here on earth before God's kingdom comes.
Mind if I jump in here real quick?
Yeah, please.
The reason why is because, are you talking about the vision of the statue?
So statue is in chapter 2. Chapter 7 sort of plays off of that.
I mean, like the immense image, the one where the head is like gold and all that. That's what I'm talking specifically for.
Yeah.
In case anybody didn't realize what I was saying.
So there are several different visions that occur that show up in the book. One about the 4 beasts, and the one about the statue that you're talking about. And forgive me, it's been, I meant to look back over all this material today to be much more precise than I'm being right now. But I haven't looked into this material, or I haven't looked at this material in probably 5 or 6 months. So I'm sorry. That's my bad.
Maybe we'll just have to do a take 2.
Yeah, there you go. No, but the point is that each of these visions and each of the explanations of these visions, or the angelic presentations that are made to Daniel, all culminate sometimes very specifically in Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So it's never specifically stated, hey, we're talking about Antiochus IV Epiphanes.
Right.
But if you read through, for example, Daniel chapter 11, I mean, there's no honest, you can't make an honest investigation into Daniel chapter 11 and not walk away saying, okay, this is talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. And that people that hold to a 6th century date, somebody like Tremper Longman III, will tell you, like, right up, like, yeah, this is talking about Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And the problem with that, or let me say it this way, the reason that that's diagnostic of the time of when at least those sections of the book were written, and probably when the book was compiled, almost certainly when the book was compiled, is twofold. One, let me back up and give. Actually, it might be useful for me to read a section. I have an illustration that I give in the chapter that I actually think would be might not be a bad idea. Sorry, it's going to take me a second. Here we go.
Go right ahead.
So this is on page 258. By way of example, suppose we found a document that contained a prophecy by Thomas Jefferson that predicted the events of American history. The prophecy read, quote, "In the future, the nation will be at war. First, brother will be divided against brother, and the North will fight against the South. After this, the nation will declare its independence and fight an enemy from the East." Upon reading this, we might wonder why the author, purported to be Thomas Jefferson, would get the Civil War and the Revolutionary War in the wrong chronological order. The prophecy then read, quote, "There will arise two contestants, one who will seek the presidency as her husband had done before her. She will be opposed by the man of the tower, who will polarize the nation. This man, with no political background, will rise to prominence against all expectations, to the chagrin of many," end quote. After describing many specific details in couched language concerning the political race between these two figures, the prophecy concluded, "Yet fear not, O nation, for God will not allow such a man to come to power. She who opposes him will be strengthened by our God and will rise above him in the final hour." We could posit a number of things with relative certainty from this information. This will be the last paragraph I'll read.
Oh, you're fine.
First, the tremendous detail that is accurately represented concerning the presidential race between Senator Hillary Clinton and Mr. Donald Trump, contrasted with the general and sometimes incorrect information presented concerning early American history, would lead the reader to believe that the writer actually lived through the events described in 2016. Furthermore, we would likely conclude that the prophecy was written before the election took place, as the prophecy reassured the people that Mr. Trump would not become president. Thus, we could safely date this portion of the prophecy at least to around the middle of 2016. So, like, to sum that up, if this text, was supposed to be by Thomas Jefferson, but mentioned early American history generally and got some of it wrong, but then mentioned much later American history, the prophecy part, or the other prophecy part, in great detail and got all of it right up to a certain point, and then got everything wrong after it, we would be justified in saying, well, the guy probably wrote here, right? Person probably wrote here, and probably in this last part, that during this last portion, because he made an actual prediction here that wasn't right, that didn't come true. That's the situation that we find ourselves in the book of Daniel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can actually, I see where you're coming from with that, because when they start getting it wrong, that's when you start dating to where they actually wrote it at.
Yes.
And before that, because you're not going to just have everything 100% correct and then all of a sudden start getting everything wrong.
Yeah.
If it wasn't in that order.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the reason for it, and I think that this is actually critical to understanding what Daniel is doing, what the book of Daniel is supposed to do. So Daniel's supposed to be writing, having served in the Babylonian, Neo-Babylonian court, supposedly starting around 605, 604, down into past the time that the Persian Empire takes over, right, in 539, so down probably close to 530. So for him to get details wrong from that period, particularly from that administration that he's serving in, for example, that Belshazzar is Nebuchadnezzar's son as opposed to Nabonidus' son, It's a pretty big detail to get wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or, at any rate, we don't have to go through all those, but but the information is pretty general. It's not terribly specific compared to when you get to chapter 11, which is this time that's very clearly about Alexander the Great, and then the division under the four generals, and then of course the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and then the fighting between the fighting between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and then ultimately culminating with Antiochus IV Epiphanes and what he does to the temple and blah blah blah. The details are far more precise and explicit in chapter 11, right up until verses somewhere between 35 and 40, right, of chapter 11, and then it talks about Antiochus and gives details that are just wrong. We know that are wrong. So that's why scholars are looking at that and saying, okay, the most reasonable conclusion here, taking into account the linguistic data, taking into account the historical data, this text should be dated to the 2nd century. Now, the reason that that last part of chapter 11 is so telling is it fits perfectly with the purpose of the book. So Daniel is apocalyptic literature. And apocalyptic literature, without going into a bunch of detail about it, has certain characteristics. And the big one is that you have people that are suffering, or you have people that are being tempted to do things like leave the faith because of this persecution very often, right? And what apocalyptic literature does is it's supposed to reveal, right? It's supposed to unveil. What it does, it pulls back the curtain to reveal what's going on in the divine realm, in the supernatural realm. And it's supposed to give the reader, the audience, this understanding of God is working behind the scenes. I mean, imagine if today we were undergoing intense persecution, right? And we're all Christians, and we're being told, as you probably were, as definitely I was growing up, what would you do if the government came in and lined you all up against the wall in your church and said, denounce Jesus or we'll shoot you in the head or something,
Yeah, we definitely
what would you do? What would you
too.
do? Right. And we, of course, they answer, obviously I would, say Jesus is my Lord and die for him. I mean, that's what
Right.
That's what you do, right? If in that circumstance somebody were to come up and say, I'm an angel from heaven, check this out, and this the scene parts behind him and you see all these angels, right? You're like Balaam on the way to curse Israel, right? After the donkey is talked, you see all this angelic host, and you see God is up there giving you like the thumbs up, hey, it's going to be cool. Just hang in there. I'm working, right? And he says, another 6 months and I'm coming back, baby. So just hang in there, because if you turn away from me, you're going to be on the wrong side, right? And then the curtains close. Man, you'd be like, bring it. I can take on anything, because I know time is limited. It's short, and I'm on the right side, right? I don't have to guess about this. That's what apocalyptic literature does. It gives the audience the behind the scenes look. But what's so crucial about it, if instead of actually having an angel come up, you have a guy that comes up and says, I just talked to an angel and I just saw heaven opened. And you're looking around like, can I see? Nope. Got to take my word for it. Right? If that person is going to be believable at all, he can't say, God's coming right now. it can't do that, because you'd be like,
Okay, bring it.
yeah,
Yeah.
when, right? You've got to have this period of time through which to hold on. And that's what apocalyptic literature does. Right? So the book of Daniel is not saying it's all over, don't worry about it. There has to actually be this legitimate prophetic section where the book is saying, like, look, all the stuff that Daniel predicted leading up to right now has come true. And look, all the stuff that we've lived through here in the 2nd century, all the stuff that we've seen and we've heard our parents talk about, and all the persecution that was the specific infight, all this stuff, it's come true. Look, in great detail. Look at all the detail, right? So the rest of the chapter says it's just going to be a little bit longer, and then God's going to break through the clouds, and the Son of Man is, it's all going to be great. It's God's coming. So just hang on, everybody, right? Don't give in. And that's what makes it effective, because everybody gets this charge and they're like, yes, we can last a little bit longer,
Well,
right?
and I think that's what a lot of religions do, though.
Yeah.
They'll take what we can verify that is true, that has happened in the past, and they'll use that as their basis to say, see, this is all true. This is what happened. It was in the Bible, and it's all true. This is why we know that what it says about the future is also going to be true, because all these things happened.
Yep.
But they fail to take into account when things were actually written and all that. And that's where they really lie to their people, really, because they're not giving them the accurate history of when things were actually written. They want to fit it into their narrative for their God, for their authority that they're trying to exert in their church, for whatever it is, to push their agenda.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there definitely are cases, I'm sure, where people are actively lying, like they know that it's not right, and they're telling, that their congregation something false that they know is false.
Can't have. Excuse me.
Yeah, right. But I mean, I think probably I would hope that, on average, or at least on average, if not the majority, of people that are giving this information genuinely believe that this is the case. This is actually their understanding of it. But I think you're absolutely right. So something like the book of Daniel, the 70 weeks prophecy is one of the ones that, Daniel 9 is always sort of touted out there as, check it out. Look, it predicted when Jesus came, like to the day, right? And so we know that we can trust the Bible, because look at how accurate this was.
And are there any situations in which somebody in the Bible especially made a prophecy, prediction, whatever, where it did come true coincidentally enough?
Yeah, I think probably the closest that I can think of off the top of my head is Jeremiah, right? So in Jeremiah 25, I don't remember what verse, but he talks about the 70 years of captivity. Now, I don't think Jeremiah actually meant 70 years in the sense that, like not 69 and not 71, right? I think 70 years is sort of a stock figure that he's using to talk about like a generation, right, of people are going to be down there. But let's assume for a second that he did mean 70 years. If Judah went into captivity in 586, right? I mean, you have a 597 captivity, and then the 586 destruction of the temple. The 607 date's really weird. I don't know why we're saying 607, but anyway, I guess we could talk about that. But 586, 587 is when the temple is destroyed. And so, if you think about even if you think about the 605 date, this is when Nebuchadnezzar, he fights the Battle of Carchemish, and then he is crowned king because Nabopolassar dies, his father dies, and he goes back and accepts, takes the throne, 605, 604. But 597 is when you have your first deportation. So 597, they go into captivity until the Persians take over. Of course, Cyrus takes over 539. So, I mean, it's not exactly 70 years, but, it's 60-ish. It's pretty close. It's pretty
Right.
close.
Right.
So, I mean, I think that's one where Jeremiah was pretty close. And, ironically, of course, Jeremiah's prophecy is the one that Daniel reworks, right? Because the people in the second century are looking around going, are we supposed to be like in power now? Is everything supposed to be great now? Are the hills supposed to be, rejoicing? What's going on? And Daniel takes Jeremiah's prophecy and doing some interbiblical exegesis, right? Some early exegesis looks at a passage like Leviticus 26, 25, and 26. It says, oh, okay, you've got 70 years here in Jeremiah. Leviticus 26 says that if we disobey God, he's going to punish us 7 times more for our sins. And then Leviticus 25 talks about how every 7 years you're supposed to let the land lie fallow. And every Sabbath, that have a Sabbath year, and the Israelites never did that. So you put all these things together. Well, actually, 70 years didn't mean that. It meant 70 weeks of years. So 490 years, right? So again, some interbiblical exegesis. So yeah, that's the one that I would think of off the top of my head.
And just to go a little bit more into the 607 thing.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned earlier in the video, that's the date that Jehovah's Witnesses base their 1914 theology off of. And they have explicitly said, and it would take me a while to find out exactly where, but I do remember them explicitly saying that they don't care what scholars say or anybody else says. 607 is the date that it happened, even though everything points to 586, 587 area for that. And even then, when the original, the founder of what would eventually become the Jehovah's Witness religion said that 1914 was going to be Armageddon, and how he was getting his date of 1914. What a lot of the current witnesses don't know, and you're going to probably roll your eyes even harder at this one, is the way he got the date was by measuring the pyramids. Yeah, I told you were going to.
What?
Yeah. I don't know if it was like if inches or feet or whatever, but he used measurements off the pyramid to come up with the date of 1914. So it was even more convoluted than the earlier description that I gave before. But then after those events didn't happen, Armageddon didn't come, they wanted to keep that theology of 1914. So they had to find some way to do biblical math to fit it in.
You remember Harold Camping? You know that name?
I've heard of him, yeah.
He was the president of Family Radio for a long time before he died. But he was the one that predicted, was it March 21st, 2011, I think, was going to be the end of the world. And of course, March 21st came and went. And I mean, like he had convinced so many people that it was going to be the rapture, right? That people sold all their stuff. There were people that sold all of their things, took just enough money to travel to a foreign land, took enough provisions to live until March 21st, and like took tracts to pass out, donated the rest of the money to family radio. Right. These are the, like, these are the stories that I've heard. Like, I don't have peer-reviewed data to back that up, but I mean, these are the things that I've heard. And then when March 21st came and went, here are these people without money, like stuck in this other country, right? It's like, what the? And so, of course, camping said, oh, actually the rapture happens spiritually, whatever that means. And in October 21st, that's when the whole world is going to end. Everything. And of course.
And, the Jehovah's Witnesses have done the exact same thing in different ways. So I did an interview with my parents last year. Okay. They were longtime witnesses. They left. Well, in 1975, the witnesses were predicting that Armageddon was going to come again. And that was one of their big dates. They have had articles in their magazines. In 1968, they had an Awake magazine. Why are you looking forward to 1975? Pointing to that this was when Armageddon was going to come. Mm-hmm. Well, in the 70s, early 70s is when the Witness organization had its largest growth ever. Well, obviously we can understand why.
Sure.
Because, hey, the end of the world's coming. You better join us, right? Because we're the only ones that are going to survive, obviously. Right. Well, 1975 came and went. Nothing happened. And then afterwards, especially in more recent years, the organization has made some hints as to it without explicitly saying 1975, but they always put the blame on the people for, saying that it was going to happen then when it was really them that was hyping it up and telling it.
Right.
But the people before that, they were doing the same thing. They were selling a lot of their belongings, their houses, some were going into lots of debt because, hey, the end of the world's going to come. What's it matter? I'm not going to have to pay it back.
Yeah.
So they had all these attitudes about it. And then it came and went. And of course, now there's these people that lost everything, are in over their heads with debt and nowhere to go.
Yeah.
And my parents, one of the things my parents said about that when we talked about it was, one of the reasons they got married was because they didn't want to go through it alone. They got married in 74, by the way.
Oh, okay.
And of course, my dad's like, well, I want to have sex too, but but the attitude that they had, and then it came and went, and it's just another one of those things where it left people high and dry. And then they changed it to, oh, well, the end is coming soon. We don't know when, et cetera, et cetera. The gaslighting in religions is so strong. It's ridiculous.
I think the best example that we could move on, but the best parody of that I've ever seen, something like that, is in that show Parks and Recreation, where there's this group of cult that rents out the park for the evening, because there's this like fire-breathing dragon god that's going to come and burn the world with his fire, and they wait in the park all night long because he's going to come at sunup, and part of the ceremony is to play flutes. And so Ron, I don't know if you ever watched the show, but like Ron Swanson hand makes all these wooden flutes and recorders, and he sells them for like $80 a piece. And they go, "Will you take a check?" And he says, "Yes." And they go, "Here you go." And
that's good.
The next day, of course, it doesn't happen, and the leader comes into Leslie Knope's office and says, I was as confused as you were, but I went back in the sacred writings, and don't you know it? Actually, it's going to be May 17th. So I need to book the park for that day. And she said, oh, there's an ice cream social May 17th. And he says, you know what? It's actually May 18th. And she says, park's free that day. And he goes, great. Oh, and get us half a dozen tickets for that ice cream social. And she goes, already done. It's so true, though.
Oh yeah. No,
Gosh.
I've actually never seen that show. Now you're gonna make me have to watch a new show.
Yeah, it's pretty good. It's pretty good.
I hope, is it on Netflix?
I don't know. I haven't tracked it.
Okay, well, I'll look it up anyways. But that is good though. And that's exactly though what they do though. You
Yeah.
know, they want to make it fit for whatever they're
Yeah.
trying to sell. And so anyways, yeah, let's go ahead and move on a little bit then. When is there like any and again, I know this is a dating question, and I know it's going to be probably a very broad and general answer because of this. Are there like different eras of time where you can date different Hebrew syntaxes at and everything? And like I said, I know it's not going to be specific, till May 22nd, 000 BC or whatever, but
Yeah.
Just like a general broad range of how you do that.
Yeah, I mean, different scholars sort of debate this thing. There's a couple of books that I could recommend to the audience if they're interested in this. And I hope I can remember the titles. But there's like a handbook to biblical Hebrew. It's a 2-volume set. One has the text and one has the discussion. And then Ron Hendel and Jan Houston put together a book called How Old is the Hebrew Bible? I think is what it's called. But basically, there are arguably four broad periods that different texts, Hebrew texts, date to, ancient Hebrew texts date to. You have archaic biblical Hebrew, classical or standard biblical Hebrew, transitional biblical Hebrew, and then late biblical Hebrew. Like very briefly, the earliest mention that we have of Israel comes in the very end of the 13th century, 1207 BCE, in this Egyptian text called the Merneptah Stela or the Israel Stela. And it mentions this people group called Israel being conquered. But we have this earliest mention of Israel in 1207. There's not a lot after that directly mentioning Israel, although, I mean, I think consensus scholarship is that they're there in the land of Canaan, developing, at least, to what the later Iron Age, like Iron Age 2 Israel, that we've all come to know and love. Then you start getting, mention of them in the first millennium, of course, in great detail. So, Hebrew is a Canaanite dialect. The Israelites were indigenous Canaanites. So, like, you have some early inscriptions that are in Hebrew, but then you have like most of the biblical texts sort of form this standard biblical Hebrew. And then you have slightly later texts. I think Job is transitional biblical Hebrew. I think it's either transitional or late. I think it's in transitional. And then, texts like Daniel, or I think Kohelet falls into late biblical Hebrew, Ecclesiastes. But it's, again, they're grouping them together based on these characteristics that you see within the text themselves. So yeah, Hebrew writing generally is, they like, I think we have a 10th century abecedary, like practice alphabet. But anyway, most of it's coming from, later toward the, second quarter of the first millennium on. I don't know if that answered the question. But...
No, that's good. That's good. I'm going to be getting close to wrapping things up here real quick. But I did have one last question I really have been dying to ask you since this whole thing started. And let me tell you, you have fooled me with this a couple of different times. Okay. How is it that you can do such a good impersonation of Ken Ham?
Oh, of Kent Hovind?
Kent Hovind, yeah.
You know, I don't feel like I do a really good impersonation of him. He just lives in the house, right? Do you want me to see if he feels like coming on camera?
Yeah, let's see if he
Yeah.
does.
All right. Hang on a sec. Hey, Kent. Hey, you want to come on camera just for a minute? Oh yeah. Was I Kent? Yeah. Hang on just a second. I'm here to help. Let me just sit down here. Oh, hey. Yeah, so let me tell you, I'm here to tell you that I taught high school science 15 years, and wrote my dissertation and opened the same way. Okay, hey, how can I help you here?
I really want to know what prison has been like for you.
Yeah, you know, I don't think I came on this. I don't think I came on this channel to be very helpful, and you know, to have you disparage my name. Okay, of course, I never do anything wrong. It's because I taught high school science 15 years. Okay, you're probably one of these. You're probably one of these fellows that believes in evolution, aren't you? Yeah, because evolution's dumb, and I think you know that. And of course, we shouldn't be using taxpayer money to teach something that's so dumb in the schools. Okay.
Well, tell me, have you proven without a shadow of a doubt your creation hypothesis?
You know, I don't think it's a hypothesis at all. Okay? You know, the Bible is true, and of course, it talks about how God created the world out of water,
And why do
that's
you
when
say
He
the
created the
Bible is
authors.
true? Why do you say the Bible is true?
I mean, obviously, it is. You're probably one of these dumb atheists, aren't you? And you know, that's what we do here on my channel. We whack off atheists. Okay, and you know, so you know, that's what I do with atheists. Okay, my good friend Matt Powell. You know, it's we just we whack off atheists. Okay, yeah, I don't have a lot of time to spend here with you because you're just one of these dumb atheists and wants to make me look foolish. And of course, you can't do it
when
because
you're doing the whacking off of atheists, can you do it to the tune of Michael Jackson's "Beat It," please?
all right, you know, I don't know. You're probably one of these perverts, aren't you? You're probably talking about a 14-foot whale penis. I am. Yeah, yeah. You're probably like that godless engineer. Okay. Look, I don't have time to sit here and spend with you, but you know, I'm going to pray for you. Okay, and hopefully God will save your soul before you die and go to hell. Okay, because that's where atheists like you are going. Okay.
Well, you
All
go
right.
right ahead and do that.
All right. Well, you take care.
You too.
Yeah. Thanks, Ken. I appreciate you taking the time to hang out with us here. That guy was kind of rude to me. Okay. I don't have to put up with that sort of thing. Yeah, well. Guy's a weirdo.
Hey, I won't deny that I am. But I tell you what, though, I've a lot of times when I listen to YouTube or whatever, I'll be doing it at work, and I'll just be listening, so I won't have your video that I'm watching because.
Right.
And you've done that a couple times, and I'm like, what in the heck? And then when I'm listening, I'm like, oh, that's not him. But
That's not him.
Just the way you do it, oh man, it is really good because you have fooled me by just listening. So great job on that, really.
I appreciate that.
So that was the fun I wanted to have with you. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. I don't know if it's a talent worth having, but it is one that I have, I suppose.
But hey, it's all in good fun anyways. But Dr. Josh, thank you for coming on with me tonight. I really appreciate it. It's been a very interesting. I've learned a lot on this, and definitely I hope our viewers that see this can get the same benefit out of it as well. And to all of our viewers, if you haven't gone to Dr. Josh's channel, it's Digital Hammurabi. Link will be down in the description. Also, check out his book, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, Volume 1. Excellent, excellent read. And like I said, audiobook is a great version. That's how I've listened to it.
It's worth it.
And
just to hear his voice, it's worth
definitely. And again, thank you so much for coming.
Of course.
And we'll see you next time.